My name is Paul Shelley, and welcome to TheAstroHistorian. This is a channel dedicated to the lore of sci-fi and space universes. This episode is another lore news update for Star Citizen. Every quarter, the writers of Star Citizen take a few questions asked by the community to highlight and answer to flesh out the verse. Before we get started, I want to thank y'all for watching and supporting the videos. Without your support, I literally could not do this. I often get comments about my channel and content being underrated, and if you sincerely believe that, you can help get the word out by liking the video, leaving a comment below with your thoughts on the news, and if you haven't already, subscribe for more lore and lore news. We even have a Patreon, YouTube memberships, and a brand new Ko-fi if you want to go that extra mile and support this content financially. So, without further ado, let's look at the Loremakers community questions released on March 21st, 2023. The first question is a common one, and one I still see often in my comment sections. The question centers around the name United Empire of Earth, as to why it retains the name from the Mezzer era who invented it in the first place, if the people of the new UEE rightfully believe that the Mezzers were brutal dictators. The answer is simple, but at the same time complex. Democracy. You see, after the fall of the Mezzers, the new UEE tried to pass what's called the Government Modernization Act, or GMA. This was meant to repair and reform the system that had been so tied to the Mezzers. It included moving the capital to Terra and the name change to the Democratic Stellar Union. However, this wasn't passed, mostly because the change of capitals from Earth to Terra was incredibly divisive. Very politically powerful corporations and other special interests on Earth were not going to stand by and allow their power to evaporate overnight, and they threw everything they had into trying to kill the GMA, spreading rumors that it would send the UEE into an economic depression by nullifying treaties and make humanity look weak. One senator even calculated the cost of simply changing the name for official government signage alone to be astronomical, though his numbers were challenged for their legitimacy. You can see just how far the Earth interest groups were willing to go to hold on to power. You see, while the Mezzers were out, the system that put them there in the first place had existed for generations before them. The UNE and UPE both had selective citizenship programs, and both were heavily associated with Earth corporations and other interest groups. Earth was always the capital and the home of humanity to these groups, no matter how much humanity would spread away from the homeworld. So, while the Mezzers would eventually become unpopular, the power they helped secure and pull into the hands of a minority of powerful people and groups who were more silent partners with them in the UEE did not fall with them. The reality was that while almost half of the citizens of the UEE were ready for a change, it wasn't enough to fully make the GMA law. As a result, the name change, which is closely tied to the changing of the capital from Earth to Terra, is practically impossible at this time. It's a fascinating topic that CIG has expounded upon many times, and one that I actually covered many years ago when I first started making these lore videos. It's an example of the detail and thought put into the universe, which requires extensive research to really put together, which is also a detriment as it requires more work than most people have time for. Personally, I'd like to revisit this topic in more detail to explain that while the UEE are portrayed as the protagonists of the story of Star Citizen, they aren't the good guys, and that the universe of Star Citizen is far darker than you might believe. Leave a comment below if you'd like to watch that video. I'm definitely interested in making it. The second question was about a historical ship haul at IAE, something I suspected they might do last year with their heavy referencing of the RSI Zeus in lore. Sadly, the writers explained that while they would like to do it and would make sense, it wasn't a priority, as it would require other teams and a lot of work through the concept phase and other designers and planners to make everything era appropriate to make these ships to their standard. However, they did mention that there is some interest, possibly from the ship team, of making some of these historical ships flyable, which would allow them to make a historical IAE haul. This is encouraging news, as I know many members of the community would love to have their own flyable RSI Zeus and other historical ships like the Tavaran Jackal. Personally, I'd love to see the old Type 4 cargo hauler and the space capsule with guns strapped to it that was the Stiletto. If you want to learn more about historical ships that exist in the lore, check out the video in the top right now from a few weeks ago, and let me know in the comments what lore ship you'd want CIG to make. The third question is a real trash one. Last time I was snarky from one of these questions, I managed to earn the eternal hatred of an entire org, so I'll try to keep it civil. It asks about sorting the trash and recycling in the verse. Current bins have no labels, so it's hard to determine what should go where. The writers mentioned that this is not just an issue with lore, but with gameplay as well. PES, or persistent entity streaming, means that everything, including trash, is now saved even after a server crash. Thus, empty pips cans have become as much of a threat to stability as elevators are to new players. The hope is to not simply delete the trash, however. The narrative team is working with the design team to figure out an entire gameplay loop regarding trash and trash pickup. An idea they float is that instead of having multiple labeled bins, they could have just individual bins, which would remove the trash from the server. And in the lore, they could invent some technology that would just auto-sort the types of trash that would be tossed in. Man, Star Citizen lore is so detailed they're willing to explain how the dang trash is picked up. I digress. The hope is that this could be used as some kind of gameplay, encouraging players to throw away their trash and getting rewarded for doing it. They even have talked about doing something special for people who remember to toss their refuse, a special perk of some kind. However, they mention that they need to be cautious as rewards like rep could have unintended consequences. The example they use is a theoretical person working on their rep with a criminal gang, tossing their trash on a UEE station to help clean up the servers, and thus gaining rep with the UEE, resulting in losing rep with the gang for doing the right thing. Personally, I'd love for them to just go with how most places do recycling today, getting money back for returning their rubbish when they're done. I know I'd toss my used cruise bottles if I got a few credits for doing it. But what do you think? What kind of reward would you bin your garbage for? The fourth question is about drama and tension in the universe. The question mentions that since everyone is functionally immortal due to Regen, there would be no stakes. This is a particularly pernicious myth about functional immortality that, despite multiple videos on my part, I still see mentioned in my comments and on my live streams. However, the narrative team begins by mentioning several examples of drama and tension outside of death, including discovering a new jump point and a Hurston falling in love with a member of the United Workers of Hurston. To be fair, the UWH does have Uwu and their catgirl revolutionaries, so any weeb Hurston never stood a chance. Anyways, the writers then go on to explain that no one is actually functionally immortal in lore. Regen isn't finished yet as a mechanic, and in the future, there will be an added feature known as Imprint Viability Score, or IVS. This will fluctuate based on a number of elements, and will result in errors in the imprint which are caused by an accumulation of what is known as trauma echoes. These are literally echoes of past trauma, including aging. These are like errors in a code and are entirely mentally based, not biological, but can still have biological effect, like actual mental trauma can do in reality. Because of how painful and traumatic the experience of Regen is, you will accumulate more trauma echoes, which reduces how well your imprint can be read. Thus, you may lose use of limbs, which will require prosthetics or cybernetics to replace, and eventually your imprint is so unreadable, you will be unrecoverable through Regen. In-game, this is when you will have to roll a new character, and in lore, this is the limit of the technology. Thus, it extends life, but doesn't make everyone functionally immortal. It's also really dark, and something I'd love to touch on in another video about how Star Citizen is a secret grimdark and cyberpunk universe. Again, let me know if you'd like to see that video in the comments below. The next question is about how time is handled in the UEE. This is actually a fascinating topic that was tackled early on in Star Citizen's development. Effectively, everything is based on Standard Earth Time, or SET. The official years are 365 days, a day is 24 hours, etc. Even the actual time itself is based on modern North American Eastern Standard Time, where the capital of the UEE, New York City, resides. There is, of course, local time, but all official business is recorded in SET. Don't ask me about how they abbreviate dates, though, the American way or the way everyone else does it. That's a can of biscuits I'm not willing to open. They go on to mention that while aliens recognize SET, they have their own measurements. 100 Geon years, for instance, are roughly 128 standard Earth years. A Banu beat is 5 seconds in standard Earth time, and the Devarn use SET, as they are effectively part of the UEE and much of their old culture is lost, possibly even their calendar and time measurements. They also mentioned that no one knows how Vanduul tell time, presumably because anyone who dared to ask them was promptly turned into a human-shaped kebab. The next question is about Gliese 667cc, and if it correlates to the actual Gliese system. It's important to note that, in lore, this system was the target of the Artemis, humanity's first interstellar ship, which used quantum drives to make the journey, and was eventually lost. Because it shared the same name as a real-life star system, the person who asked the question wanted to know if it was the same. This is another interesting response, as it solidifies a soft stance CIG has had in lore for some time. None, and I mean none, of the star systems outside of Sol are real star systems. They're all fictional and made up for the game specifically, because the writers didn't want to try and add real systems only to be discovered to be wrong later down the line. This partially explains why there are so many single star systems and the relatively small scale most systems are at, while allowing for creative freedom for the writers. The next question is about any official place names for features in the verse, like rivers, lakes, seas, oceans, plains, mountains, etc. Apparently, this is an issue discussed by the narrative team often to try and figure out how and why places would be named in lore. So, for now, they only name a few specific important landmarks and locations that are essential to the narrative. They talk about possibly using a similar name generator that they use for the bounty targets in-game now, and are actually currently using to name businesses for building interiors, to randomly name each location, but they're still torn as to how much they want to put in the effort. Personally, I'd love to see a lot of this stuff remain nameless, to allow more personality to be added by players to the verse. Some names might even stick and be added into canon later. Be a great way for explorers of the verse to make their mark. Let me know what you think about naming every location in the verse in the comments. The next question is another one on regeneration, but this time on social impact of it. Since death is no longer final, there's a myriad of issues, from the death penalty to murder, one-way suicide missions, increases in crime, and even more dangerous work being attempted. The lore team starts by tackling the death penalty and murder issues. The death penalty is already outlawed by the UEE, and since regen became more common, murder charges haven't changed, as even if someone regened, the act was still done and can still be charged. They then talk about it being used for suicidal missions, or referring it to as taking the out. They explain that even relatively painless death does not mean that regen itself is not traumatic. It will cause a bunch of side effects like memory loss, scarring, and loss of limbs. They compare using regen as an out to sawing your arm off that's been pinned under a rock. Even if it was the only way out, how many people would be willing to do it? This adds to the very dark side of the verse that isn't often highlighted. You aren't a clone, it's more like you're 3D printed. Your memories and personality are stored in what's called an Ibrahim sphere, and then added to the perfect recreation of your body based on that imprint. Remember that your imprint is actively copying your memories and personality right up to the moment of your death through a connection in inner space. So for instance, if your leg was removed before you died, then your imprint would be updated to reflect that reality. Heck, I wouldn't put it past the writers to make it so that you may be even aware of the process as your body is reforming from regen gel. There's some real body horror story opportunities there if the devs have the desire to do that, and I know that Dave Haddock likes his horror. They finish by tackling the social impact. They point out that people don't drive more recklessly simply because they have seatbelts. And the same goes for people not taking greater risks simply because they might survive. The process is still new and very costly, so it may generally be cheaper, easier, and even more moral to try and save someone before they die. Overall, regen is set to be a major plot point for Star Citizen, and is unique with very few other franchises attempting something like this. And it's nice to hear that the narrative team is continuing to develop the background for it as it's starting to be finalized as a game mechanic. The next question asks for more information about Squadron 323, the Aggressor Squadron. The writers explain that an Aggressor Squadron is one that is trained in enemy tactics to act as a foil for trainee pilots. The 323rd is one such squadron, who specialize in Vanduul tactics and fighting style. At first, they used military ships with livery to make them look more Vanduul. But when Asperia began producing replica Vanduul fighters, the 323rd used them to accurately represent the experience. They are based out of MacArthur and frequently recruit pilots who are near the end of their service commitment due to their experience in combat. The last question is about another, newer part of the lore, which recently got more fleshed out: S-pop. The question asks what it's most similar contemporarily to, and what were the contemporary instruments of the genre. Apparently, S-pop, short for Sci-Pop, uses synthesizers that source their sounds from organic noise, like crickets chirping, wind blowing through leaves, or water flowing. Now, generally they aren't one-to-one replicas, but baseline sounds to build different notes. The instruments are built out of softwood trees that grow on Sci-Se, the most famous one being the S-guitar, which produces deep, clear, and resonant sounds similar to an all-spruce guitar. There is also a lot of use of minor keys and two specific chord progressions mentioned that are popular. However, as I am a Luddite with music, I don't know how to translate it, so I will leave the progression on screen for those who know more than I do on the subject. Lastly, there are many different subgenres like pop, rock, dance, hip-hop, metal, etc. In fact, the song that kicked off the S-pop craze of 2932 was a cover of Moonlight by a metal band named Clover, done by an S-pop band named Claw. That was Loremakers Community Questions from March 21st, 2023. If you like this format and want to see me continue it with future releases of lore, let me know in the comments below. I want to thank the Patreons and YouTube members on screen for continuing to make this possible. For your best bang for your buck, think about becoming a Patreon by hitting the link in the description for early, ad-free access to all my videos. Thanks for watching, and remember, ex Historia ad Astra.